Hi, I'm Dawn Elliott, and I want to give you some thoughts today from something I learned in church today about partial obedience. It was a really good lesson, and I wanted to share it with you. Luke 5 1 through 11 was the text, and it was talking about how the Lord had told Simon to put down the nets after they had gotten discouraged after trying to fish all night long and they didn't get any fish. So he said, go ahead, put down the nets. And verse 5, Peter was making some excuses, but he finally, he did agree to do it, but he put down a net rather than, or he put down the net rather than nets, plural. So he got a blessing, but he could have gotten a greater blessing had he obeyed fully. We shouldn't get discouraged from past experiences. If we had failures, that doesn't mean that we're going to have failures in the future. We need to still obey God and do what he tells us to do. And it's important for us as women to train our children to obey fully, because otherwise when they get out there and they get jobs, if they're in the habit of partial obedience, it's going to cost them in the workplace. So it's good they need to do all of their chores, do a complete job. When they do the dishes, wipe down the counters and the table. Let them know what the expectation is and have them complete it. That way they're in good habits. And then the thing is, sometimes we think that we know better. And Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 says, trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not unto thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. So we need to trust the Lord. And our children are not going to come to salvation if they cannot trust the Lord. So we need to get them to, in the habit as well, reading the Bible and trusting what God says and fully obeying. And we need to do that too and set the example. They were cleaning the nets. That was one comment that was said as well, that we need to maintain pure lives so that God can use us, so that our hearts and our lives are ready to be used. So in Joshua 11:22, it was interesting because they had a conquest, but they left some of the inhabitants in Gath, Gaza, and Ashdod, and they weren't supposed to do that. They were supposed to conquer everybody. So they had partial obedience. And it's interesting, I never realized this before, but in Gath, that's where the giant came from that David had to defeat. Gaza was the group of people that had ended up taking Samson's eyes out. And Ashdod had the god Dagon that fell on his face and had led the Israelites astray. So look at all three of those places. They left people behind, and they all came to cost Israel something very dearly. So it will always cost us if we don't fully obey the Lord. 1 Samuel 15, 1 through 9, Saul only partially obeyed. So that was another example where he even lied about it. He said that he did everything that the Lord commanded, but he didn't. They only got rid of the vile and refuse, and they kept the sheep and the oxen and Agag. So, when Samuel came to him, he said, when thou wast little in thine own sight, verse 17, it's good for us to be little in our own sight and not to be full of pride and to think that we know better than God. And Saul ended up, using religion as his excuse and saying, well, I had all these animals kept aside so that we could offer them. But it wasn't. It was for economic purposes. And it caused God to regret making him king. So it was not a good outcome. And then, he lied to Samuel and said he did everything that God commanded, and yet Samuel could hear the animals in the background. So not good. 2 Samuel 6, the Ark of the Covenant was supposed to be moved by God's instructions, and yet they touched it with their hands and then they died. So we have to be careful that we follow all of God's instructions. And the last example was in Genesis 12:1. Now the Lord had said. If you look back in Genesis 11:31, which is the last verse of the previous chapter, Abraham was supposed to leave his family and his kindred behind. He wasn't supposed to take his dad and his family with him when God told him to go to the country that I will tell thee of. So because of that, he ended up getting bogged down, and he was there for a few years, and it was a delay before he could do what God called him to do. And then, of course, Lot ended up coming with him, and Lot ended up, some people would say, well, he at least got to have the witness of Abraham in his life to help him, but Lot still made a bad choice. He chose the economic well-being of his family over what was the spiritual well-being of his family. He went to Sodom and Gomorrah, and it was just a sinful city, and they didn't make a difference in the city. The city ended up affecting them in a negative way. So we need to make sure that we really listen to what God has to say. Encourage our husbands, to obey the Lord as well. That's a big role that we can do as women, is to support them and to do what God tells them to do. And partial obedience never works out. Obey even in small things. It will cost us every time if we disobey. So remember, partial obedience is really disobedience. So I encourage you to do what's right and follow the Lord, to give him all the honor and glory with everything you say, do, and think.